Hello everyone! The strange sleeping patterns of the Vikings, the Norse mariners, famous for plundering monasteries and seemingly having very particular notions about nighttime, are where we start tonight. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Let's begin with one of the most peculiar sleep habits that the Vikings and a large portion of medieval Europe had in common. Sleep in segments. Yes, unlike most of us now, the Vikings did not sleep in one long, uninterrupted period. Rather, they engaged in what historians refer to as first and second slumber. After 4 hours of sleep, picture yourself waking up in the middle of the night, completing some tasks or thinking about your enemies, and then falling back asleep for 4 more hours. That was typical. You were merely culturally suitable. You didn't have sleeplessness. Usually the first sleep began just after sunset. In the evening, Vikings would enjoy a last supper, tell stories, and most likely quarrel about who should watch over the goats. After that, they would relax for a few hours. However, they would rise again at midnight, just when contemporary folks would consider the night spoiled by waking up. How did they pass the time? Actually, quite a bit. Some would take care of the animals. You can learn a lot about Viking priorities from the fact that others would sharpen their swords, pray, or meditate. Some sagas also claim that this was the best time for intimacy, romantic or otherwise, and they would silently busy themselves before easing back into second sleep while the firelight flickered and the wind howled outside. Sleeping in segments wasn't a strange Viking occurrence. It was common in pre-industrial communities and was a natural rhythm affected by the sun's rise and set rather than by coffee and digital clocks. People's internal clocks leaned into these two-part nights as if they were the original factory setting in the days before artificial lights. However, it's simple to romanticize this from a distance. Let's face it, it's unlikely that waking up in a dark longhouse with 2 chickens, 4 other people, and an axe was the peaceful, contemplative respite you believe it to be, not to mention that it was chilly, very cold. In 9th century Norway, getting out of bed around midnight was more motivated by survival worry than circadian rhythm. You awaken in a smoky Viking longhouse at midnight. With the exception of the fire's fading embers, it is completely dark. You have a solid hour or two before second sleep sets in, your feet are chilly, and your cousin is snoring like a bear choking on a log. What comes next? Greetings from the midnight interval, that peculiar time between the first and second slumber that Vikings occupied, with a peculiar combination of tasks, customs, and everything else they could accomplish without waking the goat. Eating comes first. Vikings frequently kept dried meats, smoked fish, or leftover stew close at hand because they had minimal refrigeration and no midnight DoorDash. Snacks at midnight were useful, not decadent. It was normal to wake up hungry after spending the evening rowing, farming, or hauling half a deer back through the snow. So, like sophisticated cavemen, they would cook a bowl of something, stoke the fire, and chew in the dark. However, the midnight menu did not include food. It was common to reflect during this peaceful period. You could sit by the fire and reflect on life, death, or if Odin was dissatisfied with your sword technique without being distracted by light pollution, noise, or cell phones. It became customary to have private thoughts, pray, or speak in whispers at midnight. Some people thought that dreams from the first slumber were more lucid and resembled communications from the afterlife. To be honest, Vikings are more relatable than we'd want to acknowledge because other people might have been preoccupied with their to-do list for the following day. Intimacy comes next, of course. Indeed, it appears that many couples picked the middle of the night as a prime time for passion. According to medieval literature and archaeological data, it makes sense. Since you had rested for a few hours, you weren't quite worn out, and let's face it, the fire was already blazing. It's even been suggested that some people planned their entire reproductive cycle around this time frame. The midnight booty call was in fact created by Vikings. The Vikings were well aware that the world didn't stop while you were asleep. Livestock was taken, villages were assaulted, and adversaries had the bothersome tendency to appear right before daybreak. Therefore, the Vikings did not simply lie down and hope for the best when it came to sleeping, particularly during times of war or when traveling. They set up sleep schedules. Yes, there was a war plan for even bedtime. There was always someone awake, particularly in military camps or on long cruises. It could have been the guy who lost at dice, the shipmaster, or a loyal warrior. However, someone had to remain vigilant, keeping an eye out for enemy sails on the horizon or ensuring the boat didn't float into a fjord. Imagine standing watch in freezing weather with just your beard for insulation if you think that people in the current world complain about night shifts. Usually these adjustments occurred in cycles. They would alternate between two groups, one sleeping and the other keeping watch. The outcome? Nobody ever had a good night's sleep, but nobody was killed while they were asleep either. It was a Viking-style compromise. Even at home, night watches of some kind were typical. Someone may stay up in longhouses, those large communal halls where everyone shared a bed, watching for wolves, tending to the fire, or simply checking to make sure the animals weren't chewing on someone's footwear once more. Additionally, guards manned lookout towers or patrolled the perimeter of bigger communities. However, culture was at play here, not just safety. It was a source of pride to always be prepared. Sleeping like the dead was not expected of a Viking man. He was to sleep like a warrior with one hand on an axe, softly and warily. Deep sleep was reserved for those who were not prepared for an unexpected attack. Additionally, this alertness was a part of their identity, even though it sounds taxing and most likely was. Being a Viking meant being harsh. When you could, you slept. When you had to, you remained vigilant. What if you fell asleep while on duty? As a warning, let's just mention that someone might pee in your helmet. Imagine this. In a Viking longhouse, it is midnight. There are half a dozen Norsemen wrapped in rough woolen blankets, a smouldering fire in the middle, and frost on the windows. Now take a closer look. For sleep, none of them take off their clothes. There are no customs of changing into comfortable robes or winding down, because Vikings slept fully dressed, frequently wearing the same clothes they wore during the day, and occasionally adding a little extra, like armor. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Layering was a key component of Viking attire. Fur where available, heavy cloaks, linen undershirts, and wool tunics. These were more than just clothes. They served as tools for survival. You were essentially asking to wake up hypothermic if you undressed for bed. After all, this wasn't a comfortable Roman home with floor heating. This was Scandinavia. By pre-modern standards, sleeping in your clothing isn't very odd, but the Vikings went one step farther. If you were a warrior, you might sleep with some of your equipment on, especially when traveling or fighting. Unless you were really hardcore or simply had a bad sense of comfort, it wouldn't be full chainmail. However, enough to be prepared, because, let's be honest, there was a chance that you would wake up to a raid, and a surefire method to get into Valhalla is to fumble with your pants while someone is using a spear to break down your door. According to certain sagas, soldiers are shown sleeping with their cloaks still clasped, swords ready, and helmets close by. Style wasn't the point. It was about avoiding death. Comfort could be negotiated, it wasn't ready. And it wasn't just fighters that did this. During the cold, even ordinary people may sleep in their outer clothing. In situations where warmth needs to be kept and maintained throughout the night, the notion of dressing warmly after waking up just did not make sense. Removing your shirt was equivalent to acknowledging that you had given up. This was the one norm that Viking society appeared to adhere to religiously. A blade should never be more than an arm's length away, even when you're asleep, particularly when you're sleeping. The bed was more than just a place to sleep for Vikings. It could have been a battlefield. They would have thought it as ridiculous as forgetting to bring your sword to a combat to tuck yourself in without a weapon nearby. Weapons were therefore seen as sleeping companions, whether they were in a longhouse, on a boat, or camped outside. Chilly, sharp, and reassuring. Numerous Viking men and some women are said to have physically slept with their weapons, according to sagas and archaeological evidence. While some of them most likely did, this did not necessarily include holding a blade like a teddy bear. Weapons were more frequently carried in the hand, positioned next to bedrolls, or concealed behind furs. Consider it a kind of sharp steel security. And this was a pragmatic move more than a show of courage. Viking dwellings were frequently isolated, precarious, and constructed of combustible wood. Wild animals, competing clans, and bandits didn't wait for daybreak to arrive. One method to quickly become an epic poem that no one remembered the conclusion of was to be unarmed when awakened awake. Old Norse culture even has a term for this way of thinking: watchfulness. It was reckless to sleep too deeply. Even in his dreams, the genuinely honorable warrior remained vigilant. Good luck entering Valhalla if you slept through a break-in, or worse, if you passed away while unarmed. Odin had a certain taste, and the actual weapons? They weren't kept in racks or chests. Walls were leaned against by axes. Beside the pillows were swords. If you were wealthy enough to own a bed frame, spears might be trapped beneath it. Someone who could go from snoring to swinging in less than 5 seconds was a well-rested Viking. Naturally, there were risks involved. Some unintentional elbow slashes, the odd nocturnal foot impalement. For a Viking, however, that was preferable to waking up helpless. Let's clear the air on one point. The typical Viking did not sleep in a 4-poster bed made of ancient oak, wrapped in fur. Hollywood is like that. The true tale: your bed was probably a glorified sack of hay, potentially shared, and undoubtedly itchy unless you were rich, aristocratic, or at least high in the ranks. Yes, there were appropriate beds for the privileged. Bed frames with elaborate carvings and ornamental hardware have been discovered in high-status burials during archaeological excavations. These were the wooden box beds that were frequently shown in fantasy exhibitions and museums. They were partially enclosed for warmth, and occasionally they had curtains to keep the heat in and keep out snoring staff. Not nearly for the majority of Vikings, though. Ordinary people slept on benches, the floor, or big wooden platforms next to the fireplace. The degree of softness varied. Some old boat sails, or sheepskins if you were lucky, plus a heap of straw, moss, or sacks filled with wool. It was not about comfort, it was survival and warmth. Additionally, avoid picturing a bedroom. The longhouse was one enormous communal area, a panic room, a stable, a bedroom, and a kitchen together. Beds were constructed into the walls at best. You could curl up in a fur, lie down on wooden ledges, and try not to pay attention to your cousin's breath. It is preferable to be near the central fire. The ill and elderly were frequently positioned close to it. They may be surrounded by children and animals, forming a kind of heat sandwich between humans and livestock. Is it romantic? No. Effective? Very. Another problem was cleanliness. Your mattress wasn't turned over every 6 months. When the straw began to smell like goat poop, you shook it out and hoped your fleas remained on their side of the bed. Even so, this was preferable to sleeping outside or on a ship deck as the wind blew through your tunic. REM cycles were not being pursued by Vikings. In order to endure the night without waking up with frost on their forehead, they were searching for enough warmth. It's likely that you slept on dirt for a significant portion of your life if you were a Viking with little resources, such as no land, animals, or an axe that looked strangely bright. Not in a symbolic sense, literally. Not a mattress, not a frame. You, a few animal hides, and a pleasant area of packed dirt that ideally wasn't wet or covered in goat dung. The floor of longhouses was often composed of compacted soil, occasionally topped with straw to make it softer. Alternatively, and more practically, to mop up whatever spilled from soup bowls, animals, or both. It was not an indication of failing to sleep right on the floor. It was typical, useful, minimal upkeep, the epitome of minimalist Viking design. And this could have been the only choice for those who were very impoverished. No benches, no slats of wood, only fur pelts spread out in an area with easy access to fire and little foot traffic. Even travellers and visitors have been known to sleep close to the doorway, which was one level up the hospitality ladder in Viking parlance. You were welcome to sleep beside the door, simply put, not very welcome. Additionally, if someone broke in, you were most likely the first victim to be stabbed. That was enjoyable then. Sleeping on dirt had the benefit of providing warmth. It's astonishing how effectively the earth retains heat, especially when you're sandwiched between two people and a dog, and you take what you can when your worst enemy is freezing to death. It remained cool throughout the summer, albeit comfortable is definitely a stretch. Perhaps survivable is a better description. Naturally, there was no back support for this type of sleeping. In the Viking era, there were no chiropractors. If your spine pained, you either became a bard or walked it off. Despite its discomfort, this was not viewed as depressing or dishonorable. Toughness was valued while luxury was occasionally regarded with distrust in Viking society. You were doing quite well if you could sleep on the ground and wake up prepared to raid a monastery. Time travel to the Viking era might not be for you if you like seclusion, privacy, and separate bedrooms, because sleeping was a social sport for the majority of Norse folk. Whole families, occasionally extended families, housekeepers, guests, and the odd animal all shared a room and frequently a bed platform, for warmth, not for amusement. Recall that this was Scandinavia in the Middle Ages. Fireplaces weren't exactly producing modern insulation, and winters were long, harsh, and frigid. Therefore, you shared whatever sleeping space was available unless you were a nobleman with your own private box bed, and even then it wasn't particularly private. It is preferable to be near the fire. It's not ideal to get too close to Grandma's snoring mouth. The Viking equivalent of open-plan living was the longhouse. There are no internal walls or comfortable alcoves, only a central fireplace with people squatting on either side like weary sardines. If you had a bed, it was either set up on benches or incorporated into the wall. If not, you choose a location on the floor and managed to make it work. Congratulations. You were now pals if someone rolled into your spot throughout the night. Sleeping arrangements were a status symbol, as much as a matter of comfort. The hottest, most central places were typically given to the heads of the home. Kids were crammed into every available space. The outer boundaries went to distant cousins and servants, perhaps near the family goat, the dog, or the door. Well, try not to get upset if you woke up with a hoof in your face, not to mention that there was no ventilation during all of this. A crowded room with people, animals, smoke, stew, and the subtle smell of damp boots and wool. You made it through the night, even though you didn't sleep through it. Confidentiality, it was a Roman issue, it wasn't necessary for Vikings. Indeed, according to some academics, this close-quarters sleeping promoted the development of strong social ties, the kind created by shared storytelling, firelight, and the trauma experienced by both parties when listening to your uncle mumble Viking poetry while he slept. If you thought it was difficult to share a sleeping platform with your in-laws, try sharing it with a goat, a cow, or 3 chicks who wouldn't stop talking. Sleeping with your livestock is the Viking equivalent of central heating. This was a matter of survival, not some odd country custom. Viking longhouses were multifunctional buildings with a single large area for working, sleeping, dining, telling stories, and yes, even housing animals. Many longhouses were really divided into 2 main sections, one for people and one for animals. Sometimes you just accepted that the family sheep was now your bedtime neighbor, and other times there was a wooden divider or an elevated threshold between them. Why? Because every ounce of heat that animals emitted was important during the Scandinavian cold. Just by being there, a cow may provide warmth to a tiny area of a house. A number of cows? The floor heating was almost radiant. Chickens? More disorganized and less efficient, yet still beneficial. At least in well-constructed homes, the animals were kept in stalls or pens rather than roaming freely. However, the nightly soundtrack included sounds, smells, and the occasional escape attempt, along with a soft lullaby of hoof-scraping, snorting, clucking, and perhaps the sound of a pig loudly judging your dreams. As you would imagine, cleanliness was subpar. Straw was all over the place, the floors were packed dirt, and the distinction between the kitchen and the barn was more of a hazy one. For Viking families, however, the choice between being clean and dead or staying warm and alive was worth it. Simple decision. It wasn't weird to sleep with animals. In fact, it was a sign that you were doing it correctly. You were making the most of your resources, keeping your animals safe from cold or robbery, and making sure your kids didn't suddenly become Viking cycles. Naturally, children adored it. What more could you ask for than a living cushion and free heat? Imagine if you were a Viking on the move, going on a long-term trading voyage, a short-term raid, or even a haphazard attempt at colonization. You were sleeping on a boat, and Viking ships weren't exactly luxury cruise ships, so that was one thing. Powered by sails and oars, Viking longships were sleek, open-decked ships built for speed and frightful surprise appearances on unfamiliar shores. However, comfort? Out of the budget. There were no cozy tiny sleepers, hammocks or cabins, only planks, wet cold boards, and if you can borrow one, perhaps a bunch of sails. The weather, waves and watch duty were the only factors that affected how much sleep a ship could get. There was only fatigue, no schedule. Sleep when you can, and row for hours. You would occasionally pass out from perspiration and sea spray. At other times, you would lie next to barrels of dried fish and a man wearing a leaky helmet in an attempt to slumber. You were soaked if it rained. You prepared yourself and made an effort to avoid sliding into someone's blade if the wind increased, and congrats, you've earned the VIP area if you were fortunate enough to sleep under the sail. Shift rotation was common among crew members. In the middle of thundering waves and moaning wood, some would row, some would steer, and some would try to catch a few minutes of sleep. It was neither quiet nor peaceful. It was more like prolonged blinking than slumber. After that, there were the odors. Sheep, if you brought livestock, dry meat, salt water, and unclean bodies. Imagine attempting to fall asleep with a goat standing over your face and someone behind you sharpening a blade. It's not a bad dream. That's a Viking ship on a Tuesday. Nevertheless, the Vikings sought victory rather than solace. The purpose of sleep on a ship was to survive in between storms, not to relax. You only needed to be able to swing an axe when you got to land, not feel rejuvenated. Dreams weren't merely a byproduct of sleep for the Vikings. They were warnings from the dead, messages, whispers from the gods, and sometimes clairvoyant teasers about how your week would unfold. Dream omens abound in Eddic poetry and Viking sagas. In a dream, a ship heading west. You will shortly pass away. Imagine your home being blown by a chilly breeze. Death, too. Sleeping with wolves prowling the village? Death, for sure. Basically, you should probably amend your will and possibly skip the raid tomorrow if you wake up and recalled anything. It wasn't all bad news either. Dreams that revealed information about battles, crops, or hidden riches were seen as visions from Odin or Freya. A good dream could make you more important. A poor one, well, you kept it to yourself if you were intelligent. Nobody wanted to be the person on the boat who claimed to have witnessed everyone drowning while he was asleep. Incredibly low morale. Dream interpreters, who were regarded as spiritually sensitive and could interpret your night visions, were also available to the Vikings. They weren't counselors. If you were anxious about goat taxes, they didn't give a damn. They want broken swords, three-headed bulls, fire, ice, ravens, and symbols. The more bizarre, the better. And having God-related dreams? It was a severe matter. In particular, having a dream about Odin may portend anything from impending slaughter to heavenly favor. It was fantastic if he showed up in your dream giving you guidance. Dig your own grave if he seemed to be strolling away, cloaked and silent. Even in REM slumber, he was notoriously enigmatic. Dreamwalking, the notion that your spirit could leave your body while you slept and go somewhere else, was also believed. This indicated that many people were highly serious about their sleep. You were snoring more than that. While your body drooled on a sheepskin, you might have been away fighting spiritual wars in other realms. Sleep was never simply repose, after all. It was a vulnerability, a doorway, and sometimes a divine appointment. Dreams weren't just for the Vikings, they served as a means of survival. The majority of people cleaned their teeth, change into new clothes, and possibly read a book before bed. Vikings? On occasion, they put on armor to be ready for sleep in case it was their final snooze before they met Odin. There was no paranoia here. It was ceremonial combat readiness. A Viking warrior may lie down in full gear the night before a battle, raid, or any other trip that could result in carnage, with their sword ready, chainmail, and helmet next to their bed. They felt that the gods valued preparedness, not because it was comfortable, it most certainly wasn't. You had a better chance of getting selected by the Valkyries if you died well and prepared. Unarmed and sleeping, it was like wearing your underwear to Valhalla. According to some warriors, your soul's destiny could be determined by how you slept the night before a battle. Odin would know if you were ready, vigilant, and mentally ready to fight. You might wake up in hell, the cold afterlife designated for those who died in an unheroic manner if you were cozy, drooling on your tunic, and you left your axe in the other room. Someone who boasted about having 12 axes met a sad end. Of course, the practice wasn't common. Even less wealthy people occasionally slept in their travel gear or with their weapons in hand the night before a perilous journey, but not everyone had armor because it was costly. It was a symbolic message to your team and the gods. Let's leave. I'm ready. Death wasn't the only thing at stake. There were tactical benefits to sleeping this manner as well. You had no time to alter your costume if you were ambushed. A fully equipped warrior might be on the battlefield in a matter of seconds. Consider yourself the enemy, breaking into a Viking camp and discovering your victim armed and half awake. Winter didn't come to Scandinavia. Instead, it triumphed. The sun disappeared, the temperature dropped, and snow fell like punishment. Why is my beard frozen to my chest? Viking activity reduced and sleep rose during these gloomy months. Indeed, it's possible that the Vikings were the first to practice a form of human hibernation. It's a seasonal rhythm of prolonged rest and decreased activity, not the biological variety that bears exhibit. To put it briefly, they slept a lot more during the winter. And who was to blame? There wasn't much of a need to get out of bed at daybreak, especially since it wasn't until 10:30 a.m. because there wasn't much daylight, it was freezing outside, and there wasn't much farming to be done. Winter turned become a conservation period. Try not to freeze solid by February, save food, and conserve energy. Wintertime sleep was not only a luxury, it was a calculated move. Food was scarce, and less movement meant less food burned. You could easily add more layers and sleep through the next blizzard instead of burning calories cutting wood. For days at a time, many families gathered around the hearth to share heat, mead, and storytelling. It was adaptation, not laziness. Additionally, prolonged rest let bodies recuperate from months of work, hunting, and combat. If the training included a lot of reindeer fur and snoring, consider it to be ancient off-season training. Perhaps dream seasons, when people felt sluggish, introspective, and perhaps spiritually removed from everyday life, are hinted at in sagas and far northern folktales. The Norse would have seen winter as a magical time of year where reflection, dreams, and sleep all blended together rather than just as a time for relaxation. There was undoubtedly a shift, even though some individuals still had to keep busy protecting animals, gathering firewood, and cooking. Winter was a time to rest, plan a raid, and recuperate from the last one, not to start a raid. Even though the majority of Vikings slept in order to keep warm, alive, and somewhat less stabbed, there were times when Vikings decided not to sleep at all, and not because goats were strange or they had insomnia. There were moments when it was purposeful, even sacred, to remain up all night. Now for ritual wakefulness. Deliberate sleep deprivation was a part of various Viking rituals and rites, typically to pay respect to the deceased, speak with the gods, or get ready for a highly significant and bloody event. For instance, it was typical for mourners to remain up all night in vigil, drinking, reciting poetry, and telling tales of the departed during funerals. Imagine it as a combination of a Norse TED talk and a wake, with a little more ale and the occasional axe juggling. These were mandatory overnight meetings. Respect was shown by remaining awake. Dozing off. It was inappropriate, similar to texting during a eulogy, but there was a greater chance that a drunk cousin might push you awake. Vigil had a spiritual edge as well. The Norse thought that at night, especially after a death, the curtain between worlds was thinner. By remaining awake, you could sense the spirits of the dead and possibly even get a vision or two. We may never know if this was a result of too much fermented honey or a heavenly link. Ritual wakefulness was also performed by warriors. Having a sleepless night before a raid or big battle could help you focus, meditate, or just get in the right frame of mind by gazing into the fire and thinking about how amazing Valhalla sounds. Some fighters even reported having dreams or omens while they were still conscious, sitting in a trance prior to battle. Then there were Velvers and Seers, ethereal beings that occasionally remained up all night to carry out rites, recite spells, or decipher other people's dreams. While everyone else was falling asleep into their bowls of porridge, they were supposed to stay awake, still, and uncomfortably composed. One thing about Viking sleep emerges from all the sagas, ship attacks, and stew-fueled storytelling. It had nothing to do with luxury. It was a matter of survival. The Vikings viewed sleep as an additional arena to survive in, but modern folks view sleeping as a wellness exercise. Their rest had been deserved in every way. To prevent ambush, they slept in shifts. Insulation was more important than privacy, so they cuddled up next to fire pits, pets, and family. Since you never knew who or what might be coming through the door next, they wore their clothes, and occasionally their armor, into bed. They viewed dreams as possible predictions rather than as arbitrary, brain-static phenomena. They came to terms with the fact that sleep might sometimes be used to heal the body and other times to get the soul ready to die. Even their alertness rituals, such as remaining up through battle vigils or funerals, served to emphasize that sleep was not a given and should not be taken lightly. Every rest period had a purpose for the Norse. That goal could be to demonstrate that you were still stronger than the night itself, to provide warmth, or to be prepared. Coziness? That was for after you got home safely after the raid, and after the snow had melted. After that you might be given a bed, likely still shared, possibly next to a goat. Vikings' sleep, however, was not depressing in spite of all that. It held up well. They used pragmatism and a dash of mysticism to adapt to their harsh surroundings. They certainly knew how to transform dreams into legends, even though they didn't create bedtime stories. Perhaps the most Viking thing of all is that sleep was not romanticized by them. They didn't think too much about it. While the world waited for spring and the wind howled, they snored under a sagging roof, covered in wool, clutching an axe, and doing what had to be done. Rome was a city of blood and incense in 1480, a new dynasty, one of popes who ruled like warlords rather than emperors, was emerging underneath the collapsing pillars of imperial pride. On April 18th, Lucrezia Borgia was born into this world. Rodrigo Borgia, her father, was a Spanish cardinal with a thirst for blood and a fierce ambition. Venosa de Catan, her mother, was a shrewd and well-connected Roman courtesan. Lucrezia's life was enmeshed in scandal and silk from the start. Not every illegitimate daughter was like her. The man who would soon become Pope Alexander VI, one of the most controversial popes in history, was her illegitimate father. The Borgias were not the only people who were considered nepotistic. They essentially protected it by copyright. Rodrigo Borgia didn't worry about keeping his kids hidden. Instead, he displayed them, placing them in marriages and courts like pawns in a chess game in which the Pope was the ultimate player. Lucrezia was educated, proficient in Latin, Greek, and poetry, and she grew up in the shadow of the Vatican. Instead of toys, her early years were occupied by tutors, political gossip, and clandestine rituals. She was not intended to be innocent. She had been brought up to entice alliances. The rumors had begun by the age of 11. She was a weapon, a vessel of beauty and manipulation, prepared to be married off to the most advantageous family or the biggest bidder, according to whispers that she was more than simply a girl. Instead of viewing her as a kid, her father saw her as a key that would allow him to exert power over the several city-states that make up Italy. This is where things become more tricky, though. Did Lucrezia start off as a cunning sorceress? Or was she a young woman being raised by a dishonest family and given no choice but to follow the course indicated by her notorious last name? The world would grow darker as Lucrezia entered adolescence. Rome was a black abyss of poison, spies, and daggers. Lucrezia would go on to become the most enduring and misinterpreted emblem of the Borgia family, whose name became synonymous with seduction and treachery. She lacked an army and a throne. However, her beauty might be as lethal as any blade in Renaissance Italy. Wearing silk with gold trim, 13-year-old Lucrezia Borgia was positioned in front of the altar. The man who was anticipating her arrival, the 27-year-old Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pizarro, is twice her age. The union was set up for leverage rather than love. Pope Alexander VI desired partnerships as strongholds, and the Sforza family held considerable authority in northern Italy. The mortar was his daughter Lucrezia. It was a spectacular wedding. Processions, fireworks, and Roman aristocracy feigning silence behind painted fans. But there was tension below the festivities. Despite his noble ancestry, Giovanni Sforza lacked the strength to be of any real value. Even worse, he was beginning to appear expendable. For her part, Lucrezia made an effort to act the part. She was described as elegant, humble, and devoutly religious when she was a teenager. She frequently cited the Psalms, spoke with deliberate civility, and appeared to genuinely love her new husband. However, the Borgia machine didn't care about affection. Giovanni's worth has vanished in just 4 years. The political tide had changed by 1497. Giovanni, who had formerly been praised, was now a liability, and the Borgia Pope no longer required the Sforza family. Thus, the strategy was put into action. In order to supposedly rest, Lucrezia was taken to a monastery. Behind the scenes, Alexander VI filed a motion to declare Giovanni impotent and dissolve the marriage. Enraged and humiliated, Giovanni used scandal, his sole weapon, to retaliate. He said that the Pope was attempting to end the union in order to retain Lucrezia for himself. Rumors of incest between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare, as well as between father and daughter, erupted. Stories too delectable to ignore, yet too obscene to print, filled Rome's gossip mills. At the center of it all was Lucrezia, who was only 17 years old, as a symbol, not as a villain. From the papal palace down, was she the seductress who corrupted men, or a victim of a system that exploited her and then placed the blame on her? Lucrezia's reputation had already started to deteriorate by the time the annulment was finalized, because of who she was, not because of what she had done. There was an odor of poison, desire, and treachery associated with the name Borgia. Lucrezia too. She was only now starting to realize how confined she was. After her first marriage, Lucrezia Borgia became a more dangerous lady rather than a broken one. She had escaped public shame, political treachery, and incest rumors, but the next chapter would be even more complicated, darker, and more difficult to explain, just like every other chapter in her life. Lucrezia sought sanctuary in a convent once more shortly after her marriage to Giovanni Sforza was dissolved, but this time it wasn't merely for show. A surprising scandal broke out during this retreat. A boy born in 1498 is mentioned in Vatican documents under circumstances so bizarre that historians continue to debate the facts. 2 contradicting papal bulls issued, and the child was named Giovanni. He was identified by one as the son of Lucrezia's violent and aspirational brother, Cesare Borgia. The boy was the son of Pope Alexander himself, according to the other, which was stamped secretissimo, or top secret. Although Lucrezia was not identified as the mother in any document, it was evident from the timing, her disappearance, and the rumors. Everyone thought she owned the baby. Who was the father then? Cesare, the Pope? Pedro Calderón, a Spanish courtier and secret lover, disappeared inexplicably, most likely as a result of Cesare's actions. One thing was certain, despite the fact that the truth was entangled in falsehoods and missing records. Scandal itself had taken possession of Lucrezia's body. She was unable to sneeze without Rome thinking it was a planned Borgia conspiracy. She never formally recognized him as her child, but she also didn't turn him away. First as a bastard, then as a nephew, and last as a tool in familial ties, Giovanni would grow up in the papal court. As always, Lucrezia smiled through the storms and refused to give an explanation, moving on. This period solidified her reputation, Lucrezia, the poisoner with the beauty. Lucrezia, the seductress of incest. Despite the lack of evidence, Lucrezia, the alluring spider at the heart of the papal web, didn't care. Myth had already triumphed over truth. However, she was preparing for her next mission, a new marriage, a more significant alliance, rather than withdrawing into shame. The stakes would be deadly this time, in addition to being political. Lucrezia was evolving into a queen and was no longer merely a pawn. Lucrezia's second marriage appeared to offer her something she had never experienced before, love, in a rare turn of events. She married Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Baseglia, a charming, quiet 19-year-old from the Neapolitan royal family, in 1498 when she was just 18 years old. Alfonso was anything else than a political stand-in for her first spouse. He had royal blood and was a prince. Even more shocking was the apparent warmth and affection of their marriage. Lucrezia flowered for a while. Her golden hair, delicate complexion, and eyes that could instantly switch between innocence and malice caused a stir in the court. In the Vatican gardens, she was spotted strolling hand in hand with Alfonso. It should have been a fresh start when she gave birth to a boy in 1499 called Rodrigo, after her father, Pope Alexander VI. However, this was the court of Borgia. Love was short-lived. Power did. Lucrezia's brother Cesare Borgia, a warlord consumed by a desire for fame, had recently wed a French princess and allied himself with France. Alfonso's native Naples was no longer politically convenient. Alfonso was one of the less strings Cesare's ambition required. The blades started to move in circles. Sensing danger, Alfonso attempted to escape Rome, but was apprehended. Then the assault began. He was assaulted by assassins on the steps of the Vatican one evening in July 1500. Despite being repeatedly stabbed, he somehow survived. Initially, frantically, Lucrezia took special care of him. She remained at his bedside, praying in hushed tones throughout the night and applying bandages with shaky hands. With her adversaries waiting just outside the door, she nursed him back from the edge for weeks. Then on August 18th, a man in a mask entered Alfonso's room when she was away. Cesare probably ordered him strangled in his bed. When Lucrezia came back, she discovered him dead, the corpse already gone. Her sorrow was genuine and widely known. For days she kept to herself in her room, not eating and not talking to anyone. The once bright young bride was now a widow, and a cautionary tale. It was an obvious message. Survival in the Borgia home meant knowing when to shut your heart, and love was viewed as weakness. Lucrezia came out of it wiser, colder, and far more dangerous. She had lost faith in love. Her next marriage would be the biggest and riskiest of all, and she trusted partnerships. Only a few months after Alfonso was killed, Lucrezia Borgia was once more taken north in 1501, this time to wed Alfonso d'Este, the heir apparent to the mighty Duchy of Ferrara. She was clothed in royal silk. It was a brilliant strategic move. The Borgias would no longer be viewed as alien upstarts from Spain if they could establish a connection with one of Italy's most prominent noble houses. They would be aristocrats from Italy. The Este family, however, had serious reservations. Alfonso d'Este had no desire to wed a woman whose family name was synonymous with incest, scandal, and poison. The intelligent Isabella d'Este, his sister, publicly referred to Lucrezia as a harlot. The Duke was cautioned by Ferrara's ambassadors not to accept this Roman woman. Pope Alexander VI, however, sweetened the bargain by promising land, money, and military support. So the match was made, grudgingly. Like a queen from another planet, Lucrezia came to Ferrara in 1502. Rome was corrupt and in disarray. Ferrara represented legacy and refinement. The nobles took pride in their dignity, education, and courtly manners here. Lucrezia was aware that she was being watched closely. Every phrase, every action, and every attire was evaluated. She didn't falter, though. She immediately adjusted. She was praised for her brains and charm, threw elegant parties, and wore modest clothes. Initially cold, Ferrara's court started to warm up. There was no denying her beauty. More significantly, though, she contributed a captivating presence, a blend of grace, humor, and fortitude honed in the furnace of papal politics. Lucrezia also started to develop a new persona. No longer the seductress of the Vatican, she presented herself as a devoted wife, a patroness of the arts, and above all, a duchess deserving of the Este name. Scholars, painters, and poets were drawn to her court. She provided funds for hospitals and churches. She exuded the calm grace of someone who has seen too much and figured out how to live with it. Despite the political motivations for their marriage, she and Alfonso d'Este discovered a rhythm that was far from loveless, but more respectful than passionate. Her diplomacy was prized by Alfonso. She was impressed by his strength, and eventually they would raise a number of kids together. However, Lucrezia never completely left the shadows of Rome behind, even as she adapted to her new profession. The Borgia lineage still followed her everywhere, with her brother Cesare still capturing Italian cities and her father still serving as pope. Lucrezia knew better than to believe Ferrara's promise of peace. Lucrezia played the obedient duchess in Ferrara's stately halls, but her heart was still bound to Rome, where the powerful Borgia family was starting to fall apart. Her world changed drastically in 1503. After a banquet, her father, Pope Alexander VI, who had reared her as a daughter and political tool, unexpectedly became ill. His body was bloated, discolored, and gushing disgusting fluids within days of his death. Like wildfire, rumors proliferate. There were rumors that he had been poisoned, maybe in a failed plot by Cesare himself. Others asserted that the devil had arrived to gather a soul that was too evil for either paradise or hell. Regardless of the reality, his passing signaled the end of Borgia authority. Lucrezia was calmly saddened by the news, but she understood its significance. The leash that used to restrain her adversaries had broken. Even worse, her brother Cesare, who had once terrorized the Italian peninsula, was ailing, crippled by syphilis, and losing his hold on power quickly. Cesare's adversaries banded together to overthrow him as the new pope showed no interest in Borgia matters. Borgia palaces were pillaged, devoted supporters were put to death, and the streets that had reverberated with their victories now spit in their faces. Unable to contain his victory, Cesare fled and was ultimately put in jail. The once dreaded Borgia household briefly disappeared from the map. Lucrezia, too. She took the unimaginable action. She said nothing. She didn't struggle to bring her family back. She refrained from riding south to assist Cesare. She shut Ferrara's gates and turned inward. She recognized that distance was necessary for survival, but many regarded it as betrayal. Being a true Este Duchess was now what gave her authority, not the Borgias. Her past was poison. She needed a clean future. She wept in private, though. Her letters show a woman caught between two worlds, grieving for her brother and father, but also worrying for the future of her children, because to their legacy. Lucrezia had a decision to make after her family fell apart: hold on to the remnants of the past or use them to create something new. The latter was her choice. She would no longer be the Pope's daughter. She would outlast her name and become the Duchess. Lucrezia Borgia started her most unexpected metamorphosis once the Borgia dynasty fell and the anarchy of Rome gave way to the order of Ferrara, into a queen of culture rather than a queen of scandal. Lucrezia focused her efforts on creating a court that was unlike any other in northern Italy after she was freed from the constraints of Vatican plans. By bringing poets, theologians, artists, and humanists to Ferrara, she turned the duchy into a dazzling center of Renaissance ideas. Her salons, which combined philosophy, music, and politics with a dash of defiance and elegance, became famous. She became a patron of the arts, composing her own poetry and sponsoring plays and paintings. Ariosto and Pietro Bembo, two men who immortalized her beauty and wit in verse, were among those who came into contact with her. She captured the heart of Bembo in particular. The desire and literary flair in their correspondence show a Lucrezia who was emotionally complicated, intellectually interested, and very much in charge of her public persona. Behind the sophistication and art, however, was a woman still negotiating a perilous court. There were adversaries in Ferrara. She was still suspected of being a Borgia witch in disguise by some nobles. Her influence over Duke Alfonso was despised by others. However, Lucrezia used flawless diplomacy to overcome their contempt. To gain the affection of her subjects, She organized extravagant public festivals, supported religious causes, and made calculated charitable contributions. The attention also shifted to motherhood. She spent emphasis on her children's education and prospects, even though not all of them lived through infancy. Because of the scandal surrounding his birth, she was very protective of her oldest child, Rodrigo. She attempted to establish his position in Ferrara by titles and love, but he continued to be an awkward reminder of her former existence. Most famously, Lucrezia mediated between rival Italian factions by using her position. She proposed peace and eased tensions in letters to popes and kings. Some even started to view her as a sovereign in her own right, rather than as a former pawn of the Pope. Lucrezia Borgia was no longer merely surviving by 1510. As a mother, a patron, a duchess, and maybe even as her own woman, she was flourishing. But peace in Renaissance Italy was always a brief illusion, and the shadows of the past were never truly gone. As the brilliant sunshine of Ferrara's Renaissance court shimmered outward within Lucrezia Borgia's intimate realm, darkness returned, quietly, inexorably. Tragic events befell her family in the years after her cultural victories, suffocating them like a sluggish tide. Her adored son, Rodrigo, the child born of her marriage to Alfonso of Aragon, died in 1512 at just 13 years old. The boy had been her pride, her living proof that love previously existed in her chaotic life. She was devastated by his passing. Friends wrote of her receding from court, her dazzling personality dulled, her delight hollowed out. She wore mourning clothes for months, and her letters became darker, more fatalistic. But it didn't end there. She would lose several children in infancy, little beings that hardly breathed before disappearing into tombs and prayer books. With every loss, her spirit grew heavier and her body weaker. Nevertheless, she persevered, concealing her suffering behind a duchess's composed exterior. She grinned in public during festivals. Privately, she confessed to spiritual pain, guilt, and terror. And then there were the incessant whispers. She was never really free of the tales of her past, the poisoned goblets, the incestuous charges, and the secret baby. No matter how many chapels she constructed or artists she helped, people would always narrow their eyes and mutter, "Borgia." She frequently compared her attempts at atonement to cleaning ink off of parchment. The stain refused to go away. Even her once respectful, if not amorous, marriage to Alfonso d'Este became tense. Lucrezia started to become more interested in religion and mysticism when Alfonso was frequently away on military expeditions. She poured money into monasteries, commissioned spiritual art, and fasted often. She was atoning for sins she never confessed, according to some. Some thought she was getting ready for something more sinister. Her health, which was already compromised by stress and multiple pregnancies, started to deteriorate. She had melancholy, fatigue, and fevers. Even going up the stairs became challenging by 1518. Yet, through it all, she kept writing, kept mediating, kept safeguarding her children, and preserving the Ferrara court's magnificence. She seemed to be aware that time was running out, and that she wanted to leave behind something lovely that would surpass the scandals. But the scribe of history is envious. The last chapter was already being inked for Lucrezia Borgia. Lucrezia Borgia lay in bed in the winter of 1519, looking pale and exhausted, her vitality diminishing with every breath. Even though she was just 39, her body was burdened by over a dozen pregnancies, years of performing in court, and the constant spectre of her family name. After giving birth to her last child, a daughter who passed away in a matter of hours, she became unwell. Infection spread swiftly, and the work had been cruel. The Duchess already appeared to know her fate, but Ferrara's best doctors hovered hopelessly. Her letters became depressing. To the sky, she offered up her soul. Instead of pity, she asked for prayers. The death of Lucrezia Borgia occurred on June 24, 1519. Ferrara was in great mourning. Convents conducted vigils, courtiers cried, and bells rung throughout the duchy. Once derided as the Vatican's serpent, the woman was now remembered as a kind, sage, and honourable duchess. Alfonso d'Este, who was frequently aloof in life, truly mourned her. Her children recalled her as a loving mother who was kind, cautious, and passionately protective, especially the ones who were old enough to comprehend. However, the myth resurfaced outside Ferrara. Rome recalled the younger Lucrezia, the young woman entangled in a web of intrigue, power, and poisonous rumours. The old allegations that she had slept with her brother, killed husbands, and seduced cardinals were resurrected by pamphlets and stories. It was mostly political defamation, but never mind. She had carried the burden of the long-tainted Borgia brand with her to the afterlife. But a more subdued reality persisted. Lucrezia hadn't planned anything. She had been a survivor, a young lady who was exchanged like currency by influential men and who eventually learned to mold her own court, culture, and legacy. She was a woman who transformed shame into honor and controversy into strategy. Throughout the Italian Renaissance, she left behind fragments of herself in the form of poetry, writing, and architecture. Her story would eventually be re-examined by historians. Did she act as a victim, a villain, or both? Maybe she was something more unique, a lady whose complexity was out of place in her era. Lucrezia Borgia therefore transcended her status as a pope's daughter. She turned into a mirror reflecting the vices, anxieties, and genius of a time that has yet to fully forgive her for having lived through it. On September 8, 1157, Richard Plantagenet was born in Oxford, into a milieu of dynastic ambition and power rivalries. King Henry II, the first Plantagenet king and a man of legal brilliance and fearsome intensity, was his father. His mom, once the Queen of France and later the Queen of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine was a powerful woman who would always be a political force in her own right. Richard was not brought up to be English from birth. He was brought up to be strong. He was raised in the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine, his mother's duchy in southern France, rather than in the mists of Britain. He learned the region's fierce pride and martial culture there, in addition to its language and chivalry. He would always identify more as a French duke than an English royal, and he favoured speaking Languedoc over English. Richard did not receive the same level of acclaim as his older brother, Henry the young king. He learned how to command troops. He began training with knights when he was 12 years old. By the age of 15, he was already jousting, riding in full armour, and researching Julius Caesar's military adventures. He was tall, gregarious, and incredibly courageous. This youngster wasn't meant to sit on thrones, as was evident from the beginning. He was designed to take them. However, Richard's early years were marred by familial treachery. A poisonous mixture of loyalty and disobedience was produced by his mother's ambition, his father's paranoia, and the acrimonious conflicts between his brothers. At the age of 16, Richard joined a rebellion against his own father in 1173, which was headed by his mother and older brother. They said Henry was depriving them of land, titles, and authority. It was a risky, audacious action. Richard, who was only out of boyhood, rode into battle against his own blood rather than against adversaries from abroad. The uprising was unsuccessful. Eleanor was put in jail. Richard was compelled to bow down and ask for his father's pardon. However, Henry recognized something in him: fire, boldness, and talent. Though he was cautious, he forgave him. Richard had already experienced both rebellion and salvation by the time he was an adult. He had discovered that there was never a peaceful succession to a throne. They were acquired by blood, cunning, and terror. Richard was only just beginning. Richard was granted authority over Aquitaine, his mother's ancestral duchy, following the unsuccessful uprising against his father. Aquitaine, however, was not a prize. It was a raging crucible of towns that hardly acknowledged the power of the English crown, fighting lords, and aristocratic uprisings. And it was supposed to be ruled by Richard, who was hardly a man. Instead, he faced and defeated it. A rebellious prince, Richard became a war-hardened warlord from 1173 and 1189. He personally led his knights into vicious battles, besieged rebellious fortresses, and destroyed insurgents. He had no mercy. Castles were destroyed, cities that disobeyed him were set on fire, and nobility who dared to rebel were banished or put to death. He used steel, not charm, to govern Aquitaine. He gained his renowned nickname Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, from this. There was no denying his bravery. He was said to be the strongest knight in his own court, and he rode in the front of every charge and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. His fierceness on the battlefield, together with his ego and anger, became legendary. Richard reigned as a feared warrior rather than a righteous ruler, and he did not forgive slights. During these years, his connection with his family only got worse. Henry II was afraid of Richard because he and his brothers Geoffrey and John were always fighting for their father's favour and lands. On multiple occasions, a fresh civil war almost broke out. Then, in 1183, things drastically changed. While on a campaign, Richard's older brother, Henry the young king, who was thought to be the heir to the English crown, passed away from dysentery. Richard was suddenly next in line. However, Henry II lacked faith in him and attempted to coerce him into giving Aquitaine to his younger brother, John. Richard declined. Tensions erupted once more. Eleanor, still incarcerated, was temporarily allowed to mediate in 1187. However, Richard did the unimaginable in 1189, which was the last straw. He formed an alliance with his father's adversary, King Philip II of France. They joined forces to attack Henry's French lands. Finally, the old monarch was broken. He was tired, ill, and had been deceived by his favourite son. Richard succeeded Henry as King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou after Henry's death. Westminster, however, did not manufacture his crown. It was made from the ashes of a father's broken heart, fire, and rebellion. The people of England rejoiced when Richard III took the throne in 1189. He was already a living legend at the age of 31, tall and golden-haired. However, they had no idea what they were actually obtaining. Richard had no desire to be a ruler. He was not passionate about domestic policy, justice, or tax reform. Because Richard was obsessed with the crusade, he viewed England as a bank rather than his hometown. Inspired by stories of Jerusalem's destruction and the rising prominence of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who had retaken the sacred city, he had made a commitment to die on the cross years before. This was more than simply a war to Richard. It was his heavenly mission, an opportunity to demonstrate that he was not only a monarch but also a holy warrior and God's selected victor. He therefore sold anything that wasn't fixed. He spent all of the royal funds. He levied high taxes. In addition to selling offices, lands, and titles, he famously said that if he could find a buyer, he would sell London itself. He even pardoned offenders for money and ransomed captives. All of the funds were used for mercenaries, armor, and ships. He turned England into a crusader's launchpad in less than a year. However, England itself, it was abandoned. In his absence, Richard appointed a government. John, his ambitious but deadly brother, and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as regent, were left with little authority. For the time being, people were hoping Richard would come back soon. He refused. Alongside his once ally and soon-to-be fierce opponent, King Philip of France, he set off for the Third Crusade in 1190. They came to a halt together in Sicily when Richard was thrown headlong into a conflict between the local leaders. He besieged and sacked the city of Messina rather than fasting in holy silence or praying in cathedrals. Negotiation was not his purpose. He was there to win. Richard has a pattern like this: arrive, demand surrender, battle and frighten. And it was successful. Messina gave in. He received gold in his coffers, and his reputation as the most dangerous knight in Christendom was cemented by the time his fleet sailed once more. However, fissures were already appearing. Storms would soon disperse his fleet, and his alliance with Philip was starting to deteriorate. Saladin waited far to the east, prepared to put the legend of the Lionheart to the test. Richard was thrown another battleground by fate before he had even arrived in the Holy Land. One of his ships carrying his sister Joan and his prospective bride, Berengaria of Navarre, was stranded on the island of Cyprus when a storm dispersed his fleet around the Mediterranean. A renegade Byzantine prince named Isaac Komnenos, the local ruler, committed a deadly error. He plundered the survivors while refusing to release Richard's royal passengers. The Lionheart needed no more excuses than that. With icy rage, Richard landed in Cyprus. He took control of the island in a matter of days. The campaign was ruthless and quick. Because Richard had vowed not to use iron, castles were taken, Isaac was apprehended, and he was famously tied in silver chains. Everyone was stunned by the conquest. The Crusader king had already acquired an island before he had even arrived in the Holy Land. Richard did something unexpected in the middle of this turmoil. Richard married Berengaria of Navarre in Limassol, Cyprus, on May 12, 1191. With knights and nobles in attendance and the cathedral decked up in silk, the wedding was magnificent. However, the marriage was chilly from the beginning. Berengaria was politically valuable, silent, and devout. Richard, however, would never be close to her. She would actually live far away from him for the majority of their married life. Richard's character was aptly encapsulated during this entire chapter, which included storm, conquest, and wedding. In a month, he could change from crusader to conqueror to groom, bold, dramatic, and action-driven at all times. However, his alliance with Philip of France was disintegrating as Cyprus fell into his lap. Philip had become jealous of Richard's success, his charm, and maybe his capacity to eclipse him at every opportunity. When Richard refused to wed Philip's sister Alice, whom he had been engaged to for years, but who had apparently been seduced and dumped, tensions reached a breaking point. Disgraced, Philip went back to France, leaving Richard to deal with Saladin by himself. Richard didn't mind either. That was how he liked it. Just war, no rivals, no politics. Richard eventually directed his fleet toward the Levantine coasts after capturing Cyprus and marrying his bride securely. The actual conflict was about to start, and the Lionheart had reached the Holy Land. The siege of Acre had been going on for almost 2 years by the time Richard reached the Holy Land in June 1191. The seaside city had been surrounded by Crusader armies, but Saladin's defenders were resolute. Disease haunted the camps, morale was eroding, and the campaign had stagnated. They required a leader capable of ending the impasse. Richard also delivered. Even though he had a fever and scurvy, he took command right away. He attacked relentlessly using crossbowmen, siege towers, and frightening discipline. A month later, Acre collapsed. The gates of the city cracked open as the Muslim defenders gave up. But after the capitulation, the real drama started. Richard sought the restoration of the True Cross, a holy artifact stolen during the catastrophic Battle of Hattin, 200,000 gold dinars, the release of Christian prisoners, and a huge payment from Saladin. Saladin paused. Negotiations dragged as he paused. Richard lost his patience. he gave the order to execute 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children, on August 20, 1191. In plain sight of Saladin's army, they were massacred after being marched outside the city walls. There was no mistaking the message. They wouldn't play with Richard. Instead of using diplomacy, he dealt in action. The Holy Land was rocked by the massacre. The Crusaders were taken aback. Despite his anger, Saladin, who was renowned for his chivalry, did not respond with the same ruthlessness. Perhaps in contrast to the ruthless Lionheart, he persisted in showing kindness to Christians who had been captured. The remainder of Richard's campaign was likewise shaped by the atrocity at Acre. He was a horror as well as a hero. He was viewed by Christian knights as the epitome of medieval virtue, brave, pious, and uncompromising. He was viewed by Muslims as a beast in human armor. Richard was unquestionably a military genius in spite of this dark mark. In order to attack Jerusalem itself, he reorganized the Crusader army after Acre, restored their shattered morale, and started to march south toward Jaffa. Jerusalem, however, was a symbol rather than just a military goal. Even while Richard was winning victories on the battlefield, his foes were starting to pull back in England and France, which meant that he was gradually losing a larger war that was about time, allegiance, and distance. Additionally, his crown was increasingly exposed the longer he remained in the East. Richard, however, was unconcerned. Still, for the time being, the Lionheart needed to recover hallowed territory and bleed blood. Richard's mission appeared unstoppable with the path to Jerusalem open and Acre behind him. Victories came soon after. With tactical skill, he defeated Saladin's elite men in the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191. A desert ambush would have caused most Crusader leaders to disintegrate, but Richard reacted, flanked, and countercharged with deadly accuracy. On the battlefield, his leadership was nearly unnatural. In equal measure, he evoked awe, fear, and allegiance. The Crusader army was visible from Jerusalem by winter. Nevertheless, Richard paused. The conquest of Jerusalem involved more than simply military might. It also involved supply routes, weather, and logistics. Roads became rivers of muck during the wet season, rendering siege engines ineffective. Even worse, Saladin's troops followed every action, anticipating a slip-up. Richard's uncertainty, however, had a deeper root. He was aware that he couldn't hold the city even if he did capture it. Richard had no plans to remain in the Holy Land indefinitely. The Crusader governments were too dispersed, and their friends were too untrustworthy. Once he was gone, Jerusalem would just revert to Muslim control without troops. A brief conquest was insufficient for a man who was driven by a desire for enduring greatness. Richard therefore made a U-turn in early 1192. His men were taken aback by the decision. After years of marching, shedding oceans of blood, and approaching the holiest city in Christendom, they withdrew. Richard defended it as a tactic. Others murmured of fatigue or maybe a rare instance of modesty. Jerusalem would still be under Muslim control in any case. However, the campaign continued. In July 1192, Richard launched another audacious campaign to retake Jaffa, personally spearheading a last-minute counter-offensive to preserve the city. His bravery was said to have amazed Saladin, who referred to him as a man of iron. Nevertheless, both leads were worn out. They reached a truce in September, known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Saladin would continue to rule Jerusalem, but Christian pilgrims would be able to travel there. The Crusader states would maintain a thin strip of coast. Although it wasn't a win, it wasn't a loss either. Richard maintained Christian influence in the area despite his failure to retake the Holy City. However, a new foe was waiting for him when he turned to sail home. It was Europe, not Saladin. Because his own brother had started battling for his throne while Richard was fighting for Christendom. From the Holy Land, Richard the Lionheart never returned home. He hardly made it home at all, in fact. He started the arduous voyage back to England in late 1192. However, that trip became a nightmare due to rain, illness, and political adversaries. After being thrown ashore while sailing the Adriatic Sea, Richard attempted to pass through Central Europe covertly by posing as a lowly pilgrim. It was unsuccessful. Agents of Duke Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had degraded during the Crusade by taking down his banner from the walls of Acre, recognized him close to Vienna. Holding on to that old resentment, Leopold detained the king and handed him over to the Holy Roman Empire's emperor, Henry VI. Richard, the Lion of the Crusades and the warrior king of England, was now imprisoned in a chilly German jail. Europe was startled by the news. Unless they were being put to death, kings shouldn't have been treated this way. However, Henry VI recognized a chance. He wanted a ridiculous ransom of 150,000 marks, which is more than double the yearly income of England. Every village, church, and nobility was squeezed dry to pay it. Even gems from the royal crown were pawned, and taxes were making England groan. The ransom wasn't the main threat back in England. Richard's younger brother, Prince John, had been conspiring with King Philip of France to take the kingdom. After spreading the word that Richard was dead, John moved to seize control of the country by paying officials, forming alliances, and occupying castles. An impending civil war threatened England. However, Richard's strong mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, moved quickly. She held John in check, gathered obedient nobility, and engaged in negotiations with the emperor. There was a raucous celebration when Richard was freed in February 1194, after the ransom was eventually paid. Richard famously said, "I forgive him and let him wait for my inheritance," when asked what he would do about John. Under the surface, it was vengeful, cynical, and sharp. It was vintage Lionheart. The people viewed him as their heroic king, returning from captivity like a biblical figure, even though he had only been in England for 6 months during his whole reign. Richard, however, wasn't here for harmony. He had returned to fight alongside France. There was no more crusade. He would now be in his own backyard on the battlefield. Even though Richard was free to return to England, he had no plans to stay. Within weeks after his release, he crossed the Channel once more, this time to protect his French territories from King Philip II of France, an old foe rather than to retake sacred ground. Once comrades during the Crusade, the two were now fierce rivals. During Richard's incarceration, Philip had plotted with Prince John to take over castles and incite revolt throughout Aquitaine, Anjou, and Normandy. Disgraced and angry, Richard threw himself into the fray with fresh rage. The Plantagenet and Capetian realms were engulfed in the conflict between 1194 and 1199. Richard fought a nearly non-stop campaign of raids, ambushes, and sieges throughout France. He personally led his knights into combat, overran enemy strongholds, and quickly rebuilt castles. Which project is his favorite? Perched on a cliff overlooking the Seine River in Normandy, the formidable Chateau Gaillard was a contemporary castle so strong that it was reputed to be impregnable. By naming it My Fair Daughter, and claiming that he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter, he poured his genius into it. This was Richard's most determined and powerful moment. He now fought a very personal war to re-establish the kingdoms his father had controlled and to punish the rulers who dared to oppose him, rather than searching Jerusalem for relics. In the meantime, his brother John was humbled and made amends with Richard, promising allegiance in return for pardon. However, the Lionheart's battle with France wasn't the only one. Time was running out for him. He was old from years of crusading, incarceration, and combat. He experienced periods of fatigue and fever, but he never gave up, ever. He rode, drank, and laughed like a conqueror in public. He was aware that his body was weakening in private, but the war continued. Early in 1199, Richard, ever the brat, took off his helmet and rode up to the walls to examine the defences while besieging a little rebel bastion at Châlons-Chabrol in central France, a petty fortification of little strategic importance. And a single crossbow bolt flew from that wall. It hit his shoulder. At first, the cut appeared to be tiny, but infection quickly developed. Richard's skin turned dark and he started to burn with a fever. The Lionheart had made it through innumerable conflicts, captivity, and crusades. However, this injury would be his final one, caused by an unidentified youngster protecting a vanished castle. Richard the Lionheart lay dying in the Châlons-Chabrol castle chapel as the sickness crept throughout his body. He was just 41 years old, a warrior in his prime, yet was killed by a single crossbow bolt thrown by a teenager guarding a little citadel rather than by a powerful army or a legendary enemy. It was laden with irony. Following years of enduring sieges, crusades, and imperial prisons, a small-scale uprising in a remote region of France brought an end to Richard's rule. For a ruler whose life had consistently defied reason and order, it was the ideal conclusion. Richard braced himself, knowing that death was imminent. To be with him, he called upon his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was now in her 70s. She held his hand during one of their last talks, a mother consoling a son who had been formed out of steel but was now vanishing. By giving him the name heir, he made amends with his brother John, a decision that would come back to haunt England in the years to come. And the child who fired the shot? Richard commanded that he be rewarded and spared. But as a cruel capstone to a terrible reign, his mercenaries disobeyed orders and brutally flayed the youngster alive after his death. Richard died on April 6, 1199. Like in life, his body was divided in death. His body was interred at Fontevraud Abbey next to his father, Henry II, whom he had once defied and eventually defeated, while his heart was buried at Rouen and his brain in Poitiers. He traversed the shattered lands of a collapsing empire even in death. Within the 10 years of his reign, Richard had been in England for less than half of that time. He imposed high taxes, spoke little English, and left the kingdom heavily indebted. Nevertheless, he was regarded as a hero practically instantly in spite of everything. Why? Because Richard was the epitome of the qualities that made a monarch in the Middle Ages: courage, chivalry, power, and an unwavering resolve. Chroniclers and poets inflated his mythology, portraying him not as he was, but how he was required to be. His name became synonymous with bravery in the years that followed, and his tomb became a site of myth. Despite his sins, Richard the Lionheart died as he lived, constantly riding into the fire with his sword drawn and his heart ablaze. It began with only one woman. A woman by the name of Frau Trophea entered the street and started dancing on a sweltering July morning in 1518 in the busy medieval city of Strasbourg. Not at a festival, not to music. She wasn't celebrating or intoxicated. She just began to move, rhythmically, ruthlessly, without a smile or a word. She appeared distressed, according to witnesses, with her arms flapping, perspiration streaming down her face, and her shoes hitting the stones as she jerked and twisted with strange force. The neighbors looked on in disbelief. Some assumed it was a joke and laughed uneasily. The joke, however, continued. Hours passed while she danced, followed by the night and the following day. Nobody was able to stop her. Her spouse begged, clerics observed. Clerics, doctors scratched their brains. Despite her scorching feet, trembling torso, and wild gaze, she persisted. She eventually passed out from weariness, but she got back up and continued dancing. By the third day, a small group of people had gathered, not spectators but other dancers, as though something had become ingrained in the town's consciousness. Dozens joined her within a week. All of them, men, women, and even kids, were twitching, jumping, and twirling wildly. Strasbourg's square transformed from a marketplace into a panicked dance floor. There were only bodies stuck in motion, no music, no joy. The public leaders were taken aback. This was no celebration. These folks were in pain, not having a good time. Some of them were frothing at the lips, others twisted and screamed prayers. Many screamed for assistance, but none were able to stop. The saddest part was that nobody knew why. Was it a curse? Was it a disease? Or something far stranger? The city council chose to do the exact opposite of placing the dancers under quarantine. They urged greater dancing. They hired musicians, set up guild halls, and even constructed a stage because they thought the dancers would recover if they just danced it out. Chaos ensued. There were almost 100 dancers in the crowd. Others passed out from heart attacks or strokes, while others collapsed from weariness. And the dance continued. It was unlike anything the residents of Strasbourg had ever seen. They were seeing a city taken over by something that had no name, no explanation, and no mercy, not by demons or illness. It had only just begun, whatever it was that started with Frau Trophäa. Strasbourg was no longer a typical medieval city by the second week of the outbreak. Merchants, blacksmiths, and bakers all took time off work to observe the strange parade in the city square. The dancers continued to arrive, sometimes alone, and other times in small groups. Furthermore, none of them was able to clarify the situation. They cried when questioned. Some reported they sensed invisible hands forcing their limbs to move. Others stated their thoughts were locked, watching their bodies perform a torturous, continuous ballet. The local officials were in a panic by this point. Over 100 people had been swept up in the chaos. Some were bleeding and bruised. Some had passed out and been taken away, only to come back hours later with bandaged feet and dancing. There was no slowing of the odd condition. The doctors of the time provided little consolation. The dominant theory? Hot blood. Mania and excessive motion could result from an overheated heart, according to medical beliefs at the time. The remedy? Allow the body to run its course. Therefore, city officials employed professional dancers and musicians in a chilling act of irony. To protect the dancers from the heat, they erected tents and built a wooden stage in the square. They fervently hoped that more dancing would be the answer. The outcome was disastrous. The craze was heightened by the music. Like war signals, the pounding rhythms of the drummers reverberated through the streets until their fingers hurt. Fiddlers played. The number and intensity of the dancers increased. As though under possession, some writhed on the ground. Others jumped so hard they hit their heads against adjacent walls or dislocated joints. By the third week, people began dying. Accounts speak of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, and even people dropping dead mid-spin, only to be stepped over by the still moving crowd. There was no mass grave, no ritual for the fallen, only more music, more sweat, more suffering. Behind the terror, the city's officials spoke of supernatural causes. Some claimed the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of epilepsy and madness. Others imagined demonic possession or worse, divine punishment for some secret sin festering within Strasbourg. But one thing was clear, this was no longer a mysterious woman in the street. It was a public catastrophe, one with no precedent and no conclusion in sight. And still the people danced. As the dancers twisted themselves into sleep and death, secular remedies failed. The stage, the music, the dance-it-out strategy had just fueled the fires. The people of Strasbourg turned to the one institution remaining that may make sense of the lunacy, the church. A month into the plague, in August of 1518, local clerics proclaimed it a spiritual disease. Hot blood medical hypotheses were rejected. They claimed that the illness they were now dealing with was a spiritual one rather than a physical one. The dominant theory? The dancers fell prey to the curse of Saint Vitus. Medieval tradition held that the Christian martyr Saint Vitus, who lived in the 4th century, could punish sinners by causing them to shake uncontrollably. Convulsions, trembling, and violent rhythmic spasms may befall those who offended him via conceit, blasphemy, or covert misdeeds. The concept was not new. Similar dancing plague epidemics have previously been documented in cities like Aachen and Metz, but never on this scale or with such ferocity. The Church came up with a severe solution: penance and pilgrimage. The dancers were forced out of Strasbourg by the city's clergy. Many were carried by cart or slumped over pack animals and taken, half-conscious, to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby village of Savon. Once there, the afflicted were clad in scarlet shoes, each with a holy cross painted on the sole. They were made to make offerings in front of the saint's relics, prayed over, sprinkled with holy water, and led in ceremonial circles around the shrine. Some reportedly made a full recovery, others had to be abandoned after collapsing. Back in Strasbourg, the Church ordered a city-wide spiritual cleansing. There were bans on gambling, fines for blasphemy, bans on secular music, bans on public dancing, sermons thundering from pulpits, and warnings of divine retribution. People were exhorted to repent, do good deeds, and confess their sins. As though to hide the chaos and clamour that had swept over the city, it turned into a place of silence and terror. Slowly, almost without explanation, the dancing stopped. Nobody announced the end. There was no last waltz, only fewer dancers every day. And the square fell silent again. The streets of Strasbourg came to a halt once more, just as abruptly as it had started. However, the questioning were far from over. Strasbourg was not at all relieved when the dancing eventually ceased. Nobody knew what had just transpired, so it held its breath. Hundreds had danced uncontrollably, some until their hearts gave out, despite the absence of an enemy, a natural calamity, or an invading army. Although the city went back to its usual activities, everyone was still plagued by the memories of that summer. Whispers persisted for years. What if it came back? What if the curse was still there, just sleeping? When historians and psychiatrists started going over the documents centuries later, an explanation that seemed to fit the insanity surfaced. Mass hysteria is another name for mass psychogenic illness. When a group of people experience severe psychological stress and start exhibiting symptoms that have no apparent physical explanation, this is known as mass hysteria. These days, it's the mind taking over the body and spreading over a whole community. Imagine phantom illnesses spreading in a closed workplace or fainting spells in school dormitories. But in Strasbourg in the Middle Ages, it might have resembled a death dance. The theory makes sense when you consider the pressure cooker that was 1518. The area had been devastated by social upheaval, pestilence, and starvation. People were going hungry. A crop disaster had lately claimed the lives of dozens of children. The religious and political environment was disintegrating. Fear of hellfire was at an all-time high, and the Protestant Reformation was imminent. You had a civilization on the verge of collapse when you combined that with the belief in saints, curses, and divine punishment. Therefore, it's possible that when Frau Troffea started dancing, people saw more than simply a woman. They saw a warning, and traumatized brains followed her example. Hysteria theory proponents cite comparable outbreaks. Nuns in groups barking like dogs, communities where residents thought they had been bitten by unseen creatures, villages where yelling or laughter spread like wildfire. In each instance, there was only a common belief and a common fear, no poison or infection. However, not everything can be explained by the mass hysteria theory alone. What caused some folks to dance until they passed out? Why were some towns subjected to this pressure while others were not? It might provide some structure, but no resolution. Despite how rational the argument may seem, Strasbourg in 1518 defied reason. Madness and rhythm followed. Another idea based on biology rather than psychology surfaced for individuals who were not convinced by the mass hysteria explanation. Could poison have been the source of the dance plague instead than superstition or fear? In particular, ergot, a fungus poison. In warm, humid summers, ergot, a parasitic fungus, thrives on rye and other cereals. The precise circumstances that existed in Strasbourg in 1518. It creates alkaloid toxins when taken, which can cause convulsions, twitches, intense hallucinations, and a crawling sensation beneath the skin. It shares molecular similarities with the hallucinogenic substance LSD, which was created centuries later. And in medieval Europe, the poisoning, known as ergotism, was widely recognized. Because of the searing sensations victims felt in their limbs, it was frequently referred to as St. Anthony's fire. Was the outbreak caused by bread contaminated with ergot? It seems to fit at first. Hallucinations, jerking limbs, symptoms, and a lack of control are all uncannily similar to what the dancers in Strasbourg described. In a time when food shortages meant that even moldy bread would not go to waste, the concept that entire towns may unwittingly eat tainted grain and then start moving wildly in tandem seems feasible. However, there are issues with the hypothesis. For starters, ergotism typically results in rigidity and convulsions rather than dancing. In addition to experiencing seizures or spasms, victims are more likely to lose their ability to move in unison for days at a time. Additionally, ergotism frequently results in vomiting and gangrene long before it causes any kind of active behavior. Strasbourg does not currently have any reports of blood in the vomit, blackened limbs, or any typical ergot symptoms. After that, there is geography. Why didn't neighboring communities that consumed the same grain sources suffer from comparable outbreaks if ergot-contaminated bread was the cause? What made it so Strasbourg-specific? Some researchers, however, support a combination. In a community already on the verge of collapse due to fear and malnutrition, mild ergot poisoning causes neurological symptoms. Maybe inhibition was dulled by the fungus. It might have caused a psychological fire by obfuscating the distinction between perception and reality. The concept of a poison in everyday bread turning into a chemical conductor for mass insanity is intriguing. However, it is deficient in one aspect, just like every other theory pertaining to the dancing plague. Confidence. Regardless of whether it was mold or the mind, whatever stained Strasbourg that summer, it struck with the intensity of something older, something primordial, and bread wasn't the end of it. We must enter the thoughts of those who experienced the dancing plague in order to fully comprehend it, and it means going into a world where faith, terror, and legend were all the same thing. Famine and illness were not the only problems facing Europe in 1518. It was concerned on a spiritual level. Life was violent, brief, and frequently inexplicable. The general public thought that supernatural fury or divine punishment was the cause of their pain rather than bacteria or psychology. Every element of life was dominated by the church for rain, fertility, healing, and most importantly, protection. People prayed to saints. But terror accompanied that dedication. Saints could curse if they could heal. And St. Vitus was the most feared of them all. He was the saint most frequently linked to convulsions and uncontrollable movement. Since the Middle Ages, there have been stories about St. Vitus's dance, in which those who were offended by him danced wildly until they passed out. He was thought to be able to take control of the body, cause it to tremble, and drive the sinner insane until they were either dead or cleansed. Therefore, Strasbourg residents didn't turn to science when Frau Trophäa started her bizarre street show. They grabbed legends and saints. Folklore took care of the rest. Rumors of spiritual contagion were common at the time. As a sort of medieval psychological contagion, it was thought that witnessing someone else who was cursed could spread the curse. Particularly in a population that is emotionally fragile, a chain reaction could occur if one individual was affected and their group feared the same destiny. It's possible that people danced because their minds, saturated with myth and superstition, convinced them it was happening rather than because they were physically forced to. The belief was strong enough to overcome the limitations of the body. According to this perspective, the dance constituted the fear itself, not merely a way to display it. This mentality permeated even the city's remedy, pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus. People thought they could break the curse by physically performing rituals, donning red shoes and making offerings of money. And it appeared to work in certain situations. However, if faith could heal, it might also hurt. Belief was mandatory in 1518. It served as the framework for interpreting each cough, shadow, and twitch. And reality comes once belief deviates from reason. The dance plague in Strasbourg wasn't unique. It was just the most notorious. Outbreaks of a similar nature had been documented throughout medieval Europe, centuries or even decades before. Long before 1518, the phenomena had a name. It was dubbed the choriomania. More than a century before Strasbourg, in 1374, one of the first occurrences was recorded at Aachen. In that instance, it was said that people danced in the streets for days. They claimed to be unable to control their limbs, shouted, and experienced hallucinations. Similar to Strasbourg, the afflicted were taken to churches for healing rites, and the clergy blamed divine wrath. Then came Metz, Cologne, and Utrecht, all of which witnessed comparable incidents. Crowds of people dancing, giggling, sobbing, and frequently pleading for assistance. Some foamed at the mouth, while others fell from fatigue. Authorities' responses were consistently the same. March them to the closest shrine, pray more fervently, and hope they will stop. The enigma is significantly heightened by the fact that Strasbourg wasn't alone itself. What was this power capable of sneaking into several places with the same uncanny cadence, transcending borders and generations? According to some academics, there were trends among these outbreaks. Significantly, the victims were frequently impoverished, devoutly religious, and cut off from secular education. Areas experiencing stress, conflict, pestilence, or hunger were more likely to be impacted. They had limited resources to interpret grief because of their worldview. Thus they yelled, jerked, and danced. Some even claim that these incidents served as a kind of cultural protest, giving helpless individuals a platform to voice their sorrow in spectacle, the only language they could use. Perhaps a bizarre disease was the safest way to scream in a culture where criticizing the ruling elite or the church could result in death. Naturally, no single hypothesis can explain them all. Ergot poisoning appears to be the cause of some cases, whereas collective fear seems to be the cause of others. Most likely, some were misdiagnosed as neurological disorders like epilepsy. However, their treatment as moral and spiritual crises rather than physical incidents is what unites them. Although Strasbourg was the most well-known and terrible episode, it wasn't the first and might not have been the last. We prefer to believe that such insanity is a thing of the past and that we are too advanced for it today. History, however, has a way of dancing back when fear spreads more quickly than facts. Hundreds of individuals dancing themselves to death seems like a sad fairy tale from a bygone era, almost unreal in the modern world. However, the question that contemporary historians and psychologists continue to pose is frightening. The human mind hasn't changed as much as we believe. Could it occur once more? According to some, it has already. The bizarreness of the Strasbourg epidemic has been echoed by verified examples of mass psychogenic sickness in the 20th and 21st centuries. Dozens of students at a boarding school in Tanganyika, present-day Tanzania, experienced an unexplained burst of laughing in 1962. It wasn't happy. In some cases, it persisted for days and was obsessive and uncontrollable. It was necessary to close the school. There was only a social contagion, no illness, medication, or poison. More recently, in 2006, a number of girls in a New York high school experienced verbal outbursts, tics, and spasms. Panic broke out. Parents suspected mold, vaccinations, environmental pollutants, or anything else. However, following months of research, medical professionals came to the conclusion that it was a widespread psychogenic sickness that was probably brought on by stress, trauma, or even exposure to social media. Although the appearance of these contemporary epidemics differs from that of Strasbourg's frantic dancers, the mechanisms are quite similar: extreme stress, a common assumption, and the body's uncontrollable reaction. Strasbourg teaches us about the frailty of all minds, not just the minds of medieval people. Fear is ingrained in human nature. Our brains search for escape routes when the world seems unstable, when systems malfunction, or when authority is unclear. Depending on the situation, it can be panic, disease, or dance. These days, digital squares can be more dangerous than cobblestone ones. In milliseconds, dread spreads online. Compared to medieval rumors, misinformation spreads more quickly. The roots of a contemporary hysteria may sprout before anybody could stop it with just one viral video, one untrue statement, and one instance of mass panic. Strasbourg's psychology is still very much alive, even though we might never again witness villages passing out from dancing in courtyards. All it needs is the ideal setting, the ideal crowd, and the ideal spark. When it does, the lunacy will seem eerily familiar, even though the rhythm may sound a little different. It has been centuries since the dancers' frantic footsteps reverberated across Strasbourg's cobblestones. The questions still persist, even if no new stages are constructed or musicians are called in. They danced, but why? Was it the vengeance of a forgotten saint, a disease of the blood, or a mental insanity? Because it lies in the murky space between myth and history, between science and superstition, the dance plague of 1518 defies easy explanation. It wasn't a battle, nor was it a fire, flea, or rat plague. It was a breakdown in human control, something much more disturbing. A city witnessing its citizens collectively, voluntarily, and helplessly lose control of their own bodies. Records, church notes, city council decisions, and eyewitness tales exist, but they are all shards of information filtered through the lens of a time when the terms saints and devils were commonplace. We run the risk of flattening the bizarre reality of what transpired if we attempt to explain things using contemporary logic and use hypotheses like moldy bread or mass hysteria. Perhaps we still harbor the same fear, and perhaps the true horror is not that individuals danced wildly, but rather that they thought they had no other option. Consider how fear goes viral and how panic spreads these days. A cry in a crowd can trigger a stampede, a headline can blow up a market, and a well-placed and timed hallucination can send a whole community into a tailspin. We are still susceptible to the invisible powers of belief, stress, and contagion. Not St. Vitus, perhaps. Strasbourg becomes into a mirror rather than only a historical curiosity. Eventually, the dance ceased in that summer of 1518. There was silence, no fanfare, no last dancer to signal the conclusion. Markets bustled, bakers resumed their work, churches reopened, and people returned to their daily routines, but nothing was quite the same. The square where they danced is still there, but it is quiet now. Tourists walk by, and few people understand or know what happened beneath their feet. However, occasionally someone remembers, and for a brief moment, you can almost hear it. The sound of footsteps, crowd whispers, and a violin being played for no one.